12 astronauts set foot on the moon during the Apollo era, and every one of them made it home alive. So here's the question that still lingers more than 50 years later. If we could go, and go safely, why did we suddenly stop? Was it really just money? Or shifting political priorities? Or is it possible something else happened out there that changed everything? Because if funding was the real issue, then why did we continue spending billions exploring deep space, launching probes beyond our solar system, and building orbiting laboratories like the International Space Station? So ask yourself this: why abandon the one destination we had already mastered, the moon? That question becomes even more unsettling when you hear the story of one man, a man who stayed silent for decades. And whether you see it as fact, interpretation, or something in between, his story continues to fuel curiosity, debate, and speculation even today. The man who was already there. Charles Duke wasn't just another astronaut. He was part of NASA's inner circle during one of the most intense technological races in human history, the Apollo program. But before he ever touched the lunar surface, he lived every second of the moon missions from the ground floor of mission control. During Apollo 11, Duke served as Capcom, the capsule communicator, the only voice allowed to speak directly to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. When Armstrong said the words, "The Eagle has landed," it was Duke who responded, his voice calm on the surface, but carrying the weight of an entire planet holding its breath. But what most people never fully realize is how close that moment came to disaster. Armstrong's lunar module descended over a field of jagged boulders. The guidance system was pushing them far past the intended landing zone. Fuel was disappearing faster than anyone wanted to admit. Less than 30 seconds remained. 30 seconds between triumph and catastrophe. Now pause and think. What does it feel like to know that humanity's greatest achievement could have ended in silence on a barren surface? That kind of pressure doesn't just stay in mission control. It rewires the people involved. And Charles Duke carried that weight into everything that came after. The training that changed everything. Before Apollo 11 even reached the moon, Duke was already preparing for the missions that would follow. He trained relentlessly for Apollo 13, the mission that would later become one of NASA's most famous survival stories after an oxygen tank explosion nearly stranded its crew in deep space. Even though Duke wasn't on board Apollo 13, he lived through every simulation, every emergency drill, every worst-case scenario NASA could imagine. And those simulations weren't comforting. They were brutal. Cabin pressure loss, electrical failure, navigation blackout, life support collapse. Hour after hour, astronauts were pushed to their psychological limits. And slowly, a truth became unavoidable. Space wasn't romantic. It wasn't peaceful. It was fragile, hostile, and indifferent to human survival. So ask yourself, when people speak of exploring space, do we truly understand what that means, or do we simplify it because the reality is too heavy to hold? For Duke, that reality never faded. Even after missions ended, it followed him home. The wait after the mission. When Apollo missions succeeded, astronauts were celebrated as heroes. Parades, speeches, photographs, applause from presidents and crowds who saw them as symbols of human destiny. But behind the cameras, reality was more complicated. For Charles Duke, life after training and missions didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt quiet. Too quiet. His marriage became strained under the constant pressure of secrecy, travel, and psychological exhaustion. His connection to normal life weakened. The world that once felt simple now seemed distant, almost unfamiliar. And then came something even more difficult to explain. After achieving what only a handful of humans ever had, walking on another world, Duke later admitted that the experience didn't bring the sense of fulfillment he expected. Instead, there was emptiness. Not disappointment in the mission. Not regret. But a strange emotional silence. And that raises a question that has followed many astronauts, not just Duke. What happens when you reach the peak of human achievement and discover it doesn't answer the questions you thought it would? A mission that was supposed to be routine. In April 1972, Apollo 16 launched toward the moon. By this point, Apollo missions had become almost routine in the eyes of the public. The world had already watched humans walk on the lunar surface. The mystery, for many, seemed to be fading. Apollo 16 was assigned to explore the Descartes Highlands, a region believed to contain ancient lunar geology, material that could reveal secrets about the moon's formation. The crew was experienced. John Young, Ken Mattingly, and Charles Duke. Professionals. Veterans. Test pilots trained to handle anything. On paper, this was one of NASA's most controlled missions. Every movement was planned. Every system monitored. Every transmission recorded. And by official reports, everything proceeded normally. No major malfunctions. No emergency aborts. No deviations from mission objectives. So here's the question that naturally arises. If everything went perfectly, why does Apollo 16 still generate so much fascination and speculation decades later? The first sign something was off. During their lunar surface operations, the astronauts followed strict geological procedures, collecting samples, documenting terrain, and navigating the moon's harsh, silent landscape. But according to later interpretations, memoir fragments, and popular retellings of astronaut experiences, there were moments that felt unusual. One such moment involved lighting and perception. The moon has no atmosphere. No scattering of light. No atmospheric diffusion. Shadows are supposed to be razor-sharp, colors muted, and illumination brutally direct. But at certain angles, Duke reportedly noticed subtle variations, hints of tonal shifts that didn't match expectations. Soft gradients that seemed almost like color, even though no atmosphere should allow it. Now ask yourself, is it possible for human perception to misinterpret extreme environments? Or can perception itself reveal something instruments cannot? John Young, working nearby, appeared to notice similar inconsistencies. But mission control remained focused on task completion. The instruction was simple. Continue the mission. And they did. The anomalies multiply. As the EVA continued, tension reportedly increased, not from any single catastrophic event, but from a collection of small, difficult-to-explain experiences. Some accounts and dramatized retellings suggest that astronauts occasionally reported unusual auditory sensations over radio communications, tones or structured signals that did not match standard interference patterns. But space is complex. Communication systems are vulnerable to distortion, lag, and electromagnetic noise. Even trained astronauts can misinterpret signals under fatigue and high cognitive load. Still, the human mind doesn't easily dismiss what it thinks it experiences. And that leads to a deeper question. When reality conflicts with expectation, which one do we trust? The instruments calibrated by science, or the human brain evolved to detect danger? The feeling of being watched. Perhaps the most psychologically powerful element often associated with Apollo-era astronaut stories isn't something measurable at all. It's perception. A sense of awareness. A feeling, subtle, persistent, and difficult to define. Not fear in the traditional sense. Not panic. But the sensation that the environment itself was no longer entirely empty. Of course, in scientific terms, the moon is a lifeless body. No atmosphere. No known biological activity. No mechanism for observation as humans understand it. And yet, humans are not machines. Isolation, silence, and extreme environments can alter cognition in profound ways. Even experienced test pilots, men trained to remain calm under pressure, can experience heightened sensitivity when placed in absolute isolation. So the question becomes less about what was out there, and more about what the human mind does when it is completely alone in a place no human evolved to survive. The mystery that never fully closed. Apollo ended not because of a single incident, but because priorities shifted, budgets changed, political momentum slowed, and the world's attention moved elsewhere. But the emotional and psychological impact of those missions never disappeared. For astronauts like Charles Duke, the moon was never just a destination marked on a mission checklist. It was something far more profound. A place where distance did not only separate Earth from the astronaut, but separated the old version of the self from something entirely transformed. A silence so complete it felt alive. A horizon so unfamiliar it challenged the very idea of home. And so the question continues to echo across time, refusing to fade into history. If humanity truly mastered the moon, why did we stop going back? Was it simply economics, shifting political priorities, and the closing chapter of the Cold War-era space race? Or was it something less comfortable to say out loud, Something that lingers in the gaps between official explanations? Was it the realization that the farther we travel outward, the more we are forced inward, confronting not only new worlds, but the fragile nature of our own understanding? And perhaps the deepest question of all remains suspended in that lunar silence. When humanity finally stood on the surface of another world and looked back at Earth hanging in black space, what did we expect to find in that moment of ultimate perspective? And what did we actually discover instead? Because sometimes, the most important mysteries are not written in space itself. They are written in the people who went there, and came back changed in ways they could never fully explain. The discovery. The lunar terrain stretched endlessly under a sky that had no atmosphere, no sound, and no forgiveness. For Charles Duke and John Young, every movement across the moon's surface carried a strange contradiction. Monumental freedom paired with absolute isolation. Every footstep echoed only in memory. Every breath reminded them of life existing inside a fragile suit. Then, in the distance, something began to break the uniformity of the horizon. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than an unusual rock formation, just another distortion in a landscape already shaped by ancient impacts and cosmic violence. But as they advanced, the mind began to resist that explanation. Because the shape did not behave like geology. It did not erode like stone. It did not scatter like debris. It held symmetry. Too much symmetry. Straight edges where nature preferred chaos. Sharp angles where time usually softened everything. And so the human mind, trained to identify patterns, began to hesitate. What happens when recognition fails in a place where nothing should be familiar? They moved closer. The structure grew clearer. Massive block-like sections appeared partially buried beneath lunar soil, as if time itself had tried, and failed, to erase it. It stretched roughly 100 meters, its scale too deliberate to dismiss easily. And then the thought emerged that neither astronaut wanted to fully accept. What if this was not natural? What if something had been built here? But built by whom? And when? And why? On a world where no known civilization had ever existed. They stopped at a cautious distance. The silence between them was heavier than the vacuum outside their suits. Then came the communication. They contacted Mission Control. They described the structure in careful, measured language, technical, restrained, professional. But on the other end of the transmission, something unusual happened. A pause. Not the normal processing delay. Something longer. More deliberate. When the response finally came, the voice was calm. Controlled. Almost detached. Do not approach. Photograph from your current position. Then proceed with the mission timeline. No questions. No curiosity. No sense of scientific urgency. Just instruction. And that raised a question neither astronaut voiced immediately. Is that how science reacts to the unknown, or how secrecy reacts to something it already understands? The missing evidence. Following orders, they documented everything. Cameras captured the formation from a distance. Angles were recorded. Coordinates were noted. And then, they moved on, leaving the structure behind them like a thought they were not permitted to finish. But the true mystery did not begin on the moon. It began after they returned to Earth. When Charles Duke reviewed the mission imagery, something was wrong. The photographs were not where they should have been. At first, he was told they were undergoing scientific analysis. Then, that there had been technical malfunctions during data transfer. Later, that the images were classified for review. And finally, that they had been lost entirely. 4 explanations. Each one replacing the last. Each one more final, yet less satisfying than the one before it. So what does it mean when evidence changes shape depending on who is asking? And why would something so simple as a photograph require so many different endings? Because the truth, by its nature, rarely needs revision. Only uncertainty does. The detail he didn't want to share. 4 years, silence surrounded certain parts of the mission. Charles Duke could speak about geology, craters, and navigation with precision. He could describe the moon's surface in scientific terms that satisfied textbooks and documentaries. But there was one part of the experience that never settled comfortably into language. Because some observations, once spoken aloud, change everything that came before them. While observing the structure, something moved. Not shifting dust. Not a trick of light. Not the illusion created by distance or fatigue. Something upright. Deliberate. Controlled. A form that resembled a humanoid silhouette, but did not behave in a way that suggested humanity. It moved along the edge of the structure with intention, as if the environment belonged to it. And in that moment, two astronauts trained to trust observation over imagination were forced into a rare internal conflict. Do we trust what we see, or what we are told is possible? John Young saw it too. There was no disagreement between them. No confusion shared later as a correction. Only recognition. And then urgency. Duke raised his camera. A photograph was taken. That image, according to accounts often discussed in later years, existed, at least for a time. It was reviewed during debriefing. And then, like the earlier images, it disappeared from the official record. So the question becomes unavoidable. If something is documented, and then removed, what exactly happened in between? And perhaps more unsettling, who decides what remains real in history? Why wait 50 years? Why would someone like Charles Duke remain silent for so long? Why speak only in fragments, decades later, when the world has already formed its version of events? The answer may not be mystery, it may be responsibility. A lifetime built on discipline, precision, and institutional trust is not easily set aside. When your identity is tied to credibility, every word carries weight far beyond personal memory. So what would it take for someone like that to finally speak? Not speculation. Not rumor. But time. Enough time for consequences to become less immediate than truth. A pattern emerges. Charles Duke is not the only figure associated, fairly or not, with unusual reflections about the Apollo era. Edgar Mitchell later spoke publicly about the possibility of non-human intelligence being part of broader conversations surrounding unexplained phenomena. Al Wardens also suggested in interviews that information may exist beyond what has been shared with the public. These statements are often interpreted in different ways. Some see curiosity. Others see metaphor. And some see implication. But the deeper question is not what each individual said. It is why multiple individuals, separated by missions and years, circle similar ideas when speaking about experiences that changed them. Coincidence? Or convergence? The question that changes everything. Humanity has not returned to the moon since 1972. Not once. Despite advances in technology that would have made earlier missions seem primitive by comparison. So the question becomes unavoidable. Was stopping a matter of capability or choice? And if it was a choice, what informed it? Because every decision leaves behind an absence. And sometimes, absence speaks louder than presence ever could. What if the end of lunar missions was not the conclusion of exploration, but the beginning of reinterpretation? What if continuing forward meant revisiting questions that were never fully answered? And what if those answers were not comfortable ones? Final reflection. Charles Duke is now in the later chapters of his life. There is no mission to prepare for. No program to represent. No institutional future to protect. Only memory. And memory, unlike documentation, cannot be fully classified or deleted. It remains personal. Unresolved. And now, as this account is retold and reinterpreted across generations, it leaves behind a final set of questions. Questions that do not demand answers, but refuse to disappear. If even a fraction of what is claimed or remembered is true, what does it say about what we think we know? And more importantly, how much of history is discovery? And how much of it is decision? Because sometimes, the greatest unknown is not what lies beyond Earth, but what humanity chooses to carry back from the places it visits.